next. I mean, it's recording somewhere magically. Right, we'll give it another 60 seconds, then we'll get cracking. Hopefully the rest of the session will be less frantic than my inability to know where to record to. Right, I'm gonna... Okay, let's go. Morgan, you can do introductions.
Hello, everybody. We are Zoe and Morgan, two of the WOX mentors. And this evening, for you guys, we're going to talk about recordings. We're going to talk a little bit about why we do them as coxes, why they're useful and advantageous, and probably one of the best tools that we've got. And we'll even show you some of our recordings, and we're essentially just going to show you how we kind of break them down a little bit, identify different strengths, areas for improvement or opportunities, and how that kind of all comes together to allow you to both work with either your coaches or other supportive teammates on building a strategy for your own improvement, or you work by yourself and kind of have that development strategy and plan in place. So that's kind of today's little webinar series. Zoe and I, there'll be similarities and there'll be differences in our coxing styles. And I think that's a kind of important thing for us to share with you guys, is that every person's voice is different. Sometimes I think I sound like a prepubescent male. That's my voice, and I can't change that. And and so I think it's important to understand what your kind of sweet spot is when you're coxing, and that your tone will be different, but how you use your voice in a way that is most optimum for you, and how that kind of creates opportunities to build boat speed.
So we are going to kind of go through a little bit about, why we listen to recordings, how we analyze our recordings. And then Morgan and I are each going to share a minute or 90 seconds of a recording. And then we will be asking the room and each other to sort of help us analyze them. So we're really keen that people get involved. You can, if we're asking a question, you can unmute yourself and shout out. You can type stuff in the chat.
She was saying,
oh, someone's come on a little early. Whatever works for you, but please do get involved. Even if it's just sort of bullet points on the chat, we'd love to hear from you, because otherwise we'll just talk to each other, and we can just talk to each other for an hour quite comfortably. So yeah, don't let us, basically. At the end, if we have time, and if someone's brave enough and has a recording with them, and would like to share a minute of their own recording, we would love to hear someone's, and if more than one person volunteers, we'll pick at random. But if you would be happy to share a minute of your recording, if there's time at the end of the session, and have the whole group listen to it, then just stick a meeting either directly to me or just on the group chat, just saying, yes, I'm happy. I suspect we might run out of time before we get there, but if we get there and we have time, then we'll give that a go as well. So the first thing is, why bother? Why do we listen to recordings? And if anyone has got ideas about that, again, stick them in the chat, shout them out. I'd say that when I first started listening, no, I'm going to rephrase. I was about to say, when I first started listening to my recordings, I found it really cringy. But the whole way through listening to my recordings, I found it really cringy. The very last, listening to my recording to get for this session, I found cringy. So I think it's just something that you've got to get used to. But has anyone got any ideas about, why we should do it, why it's important, what's worked for you, that kind of thing? We'll keep talking until someone types something, but feel free to join in. But yeah, Morgan, your thoughts on kind of why it's important to you?
I think for me, if I think about in its rawest form what we do as coxes, we kind of we use words, you know, we use our voice to attempt to get some sort of response from the rowers. And coxing is like incredibly psychological because you're just asking somebody to do something, and depending on how you've asked it, you know, what you've asked for, then that individual you've asked decides whether they do it or not. And so going back over recording gives you an opportunity to see how you've done that and see. I think people sometimes think that we go over recordings just to rip them apart and pull out all the negatives. And actually, one of the most important parts is going back through and seeing what you do really well, and holding on to kind of that skill set. I think you want to build up your armory, you want to build up your strengths so that when you go into battle, you're like, right, these are all my strengths and I'm going to make sure I play to them. At the same time, it then offers you areas for improvement where you've got maybe one area that you're going to focus on. But I think Zoe's absolutely right. Like every time you do it, it is just a bit cringe. But sometimes you might get one and you're like, oh, that was good. Yeah, okay. Yeah, keep going. And then you say something really bad and you're like, never mind, you know. But I think that's totally normal. I think also you've got to remember that everyone has a different opinion. And that's also part of coxing in itself, is one thing might work for one rower, but it might not work for another one. And so part of coxing and part of racing is kind of pulling together different tactics that get the most out of each individual within the boat.
I think one of the things that I found, oh yeah, we've had a good one here about recordings as well, which is it helps coaches who can't always hear what you're saying in the boat to see and assess what your coxing is like, basically. So that's, yeah, that is really important as well. I mean, one of the things I found really useful with recording, analysing my own recordings, was that I like, you know, I like being able to find measurable ways to record my own progression. And I think if you're a rower, that can be quite easy. It's like, oh, well, my 2K is faster than it was 6 months ago, or oh, my deadlift is heavier than it was, or, you know, or whatever it might be, or now I'm coming second in the single, not third. And with coxing, that's really difficult. So for me, it was a good way to be able to check on measurable goals. And we'll come back to this later about these SMART goals. But, you know, I might say, oh, well, I'm working on using the rowers' names more during pieces. As something, you know, very simple and straightforward like that. And then actually I can go back and I can listen to my recording and I can say, yep, I did that. I used everyone's name during this recording. I was getting good reactions from it. So I have ticked that box that, yes, I have made that change I was trying to make. So that for me was really useful because I like having that feedback. I'm a needy person and I need to be able to have that sort of defined feedback, I guess.
I think also it allows you to revisit past performances, because I think you can get on a tangent where you're just listening to current recordings, and there might be something from a few years ago that you did really well, and you kind of lost that a little bit, and you want to be able to bring that back in. So, you know, just because a recording you might think is old, that doesn't mean it's not useful. You know, sometimes they're the best ones.
So another question, oh yes, again, that's I think similar that Ishan, to what Morgan was saying as well, is that it helps you to hear what you've said outside of the adrenaline of the situations. You can go back to things and look at those little habits you have and stuff. One question we had actually in the sign up form that we wanted to kind of cover off was what to use to record. So I used to use a dictaphone that I bought off Amazon for I think about 20 quid. Which I'd keep in a waterproof bag. And eventually then I bought a little microphone, a wired microphone that I could just clip onto my lapel. The quality wasn't great. I think the recording that I will play, and I think actually Morgan's recording as well, I think were both done on one of the Cox Orbs. Were they? Was yours, Morgan?
Mine's a GoPro, but I think
yeah.
Yeah, I've used all sorts really, the Cox Orbs, dictaphones. I never got around to using my Apple Watch, but that is the current trendy thing to use.
Yeah. And then Morgan, when we were talking about this, said, oh, and a TikTok microphone. And then we all had to get her to clarify what she meant by a TikTok microphone. But you basically mean one of those little Bluetooth like clip-on microphones, don't you?
Yeah.
So there's lots of ways around it. So even if you don't have access to that Cox Orb that can record, you know, there are sort of relatively cheap ways of finding. And I suspect equipment, a 20 quid dictaphone is going to be much better quality than the one I was using 10, 15 years ago. So I think there's plenty of ways that you can find. Obviously, if you're using a dictaphone, make sure it's got like a USB or Bluetooth, so it's easy to actually listen to your recordings.
My first ever recordings I actually did on a cassette tape, and I duct taped this cassette tape to my life jacket, and then I think I went to post those tapes to Richard Bolton for GB Junior Trials, and someone was like, "You can't send that," and I was like, "Well, what?" Like they were like, asked me to send tapes, so I made tapes. Like I just didn't know what they were asking. And I was like, "Well, how am I going to convert these to like, I don't know, MP3?" Yeah, so that's how I started out.
That's aging you, frankly.
What's on why?
Yeah. So then the next thing we wanted to talk about was the sort of methods you use to analyze. And this is, I think, quite personal. Um, some people like, a spreadsheet, some people like to journal. Some people are going to be wanting to do this on their own. Some people will want to sit down with their coach. Some people are happy to do this in a group. So I think you've got to kind of look at what works for you. One thing I would say that everyone should be doing, and please learn from my mistakes here, is to label and actually organize these recordings well. And I have a lot of recordings that say things like a 5K piece at rate 24 or something. And that's like the name of the recording. And I swear to this day that I recorded my Olympic heat and I can't find it. It's gone. So, you've got to make sure that you actually store this stuff well, whatever you do. But I think, you've got to kind of see what works for you. Some people want a bit more structure. And I think it was Henry Fieldman, who's the current cox of the British Women's Eight, who was talking to one of our other WOX mentors and was kind of helping her, had helped her develop a sort of list of headings under which she could jot down her notes. And that kind of created a template. So she had quite a structured process to go through when she was listening to recordings. That might be a bit too much for some people. Some people might want to go in with just a very specific thing, like I was saying about how, I just want to see if I'm using people's names better, or I want to see, I want to make sure that everything I'm saying is really clear and concise. It might be just one very specific thing. So you need to find something that works for you. And also, I think, like anything, don't be afraid to change the system. I think, I don't know, Morgan, you might get this as well, but sometimes I find that if I start a system, I then can't break out of it, even if it's not really working for me. So if you've started journaling and actually you find that you need something more structured, don't be afraid to kind of move into something new.
I definitely used to do a little bit of both. So I knew I would always have a notepad with me. That's pretty portable. Didn't always have my computer, so wherever I was, I could write things down. But then I might rewrite up those notes, and I think that helps you think back over it as well. So I definitely used a little bit of both, really.
So yeah, I think it's just finding that what works, and I think one of the things that we're really keen on, and again, I think there was a question about it, was sort of about sharing your recordings with others. Like, one of the reasons why we wanted to do this was to kind of demystify this idea that if you share a couple minutes of recordings with someone else on your team, then they're suddenly going to like know all your secrets and suddenly be a better like steal your coxing essence or something. I'm not sure, your magical wizard something. Sorry, I'm plugging in my computer. I'm not disappearing. I promise I'm still here. And so I think, group analysis is really good. So if you can get a group of coxes that you work together with on your team, and you can say, okay, guys, we're gonna meet on the weekend, and we're each gonna bring a minute of our recordings, and we're gonna play them all, and then we're gonna all go through giving feedback, positive and stuff to work on. It's really powerful, I think. And Morgan, I mean, that's something you guys do, isn't it, in your current setup?
Yeah, and I think initially it seems really daunting, and you don't want to be the one that goes first. So for me, I would share one of mine first. But I think it's like the fastest route to getting good quite quickly. You've got more brains in the room. You've got more people who are doing the same thing as you, that really understand it, working with the same people. And I think if you have that kind of open, communicable environment, then the opportunities are far greater. And I think, everything pinch of salt. Like, you're not gonna please everybody, but people can offer you feedback. And I think the other thing as well is anyone can listen to a recording and tell you something about it. So your mum, your dad, your nan, your granddad, some absolute randomer who knows nothing about rowing could give you some sort of feedback on your recording, because they're listening to something, and it's what you're looking for is the response of the individual when they hear something, and you can get that from anybody, maybe even your dog.
I think the last time I played a recording, my dog actually ran away. Um,
Was it mine?
no, it was mine. Don't worry. But this also came down. There was a question clearly from a coach. A couple of questions actually that was about how do I encourage my athletes to be confident sharing their recordings, and I think it is by making it commonplace. So, so it's just a thing that you do, and it's not a big stress. It's not worked up into a big palaver. It's just, well, once a week, all the coxes sit down together and we share a bit of recording and we have a chat about it. And the first week you do it, maybe you pick some off the internet and you get them used to just listening to recordings and discussing them. And then the second week they start bringing their own recordings, and maybe you start with the more senior people, the more senior coxes. Don't pick on the novice cox who's only been there for a month or something. And then slowly over time, you just get everyone used to it just being part and parcel of the sport, of your club, of your ethos, of all the coxes working together. Because I think that's a lot of the issue with coxing feedback, and coxes will know this, the coxes on the call, is that quite often the coxing feedback is made into quite a big deal. It's like, oh, we've given a feedback form out to everyone once every 3 months, and now we're going to sit down and we're going to discuss that feedback in this really formal setting. But actually, coxing feedback, and this is what we believe and why we're here really at WOX, is you should be receiving it in the same way that the rowers do. So it's daily, it's part of the outing, it's part of the briefing, it's part of the debrief. It's a communication back and forth. It's not just a telling off when something goes wrong. And listening to recordings and analysing them would just be part of that, would be every day, not a daunting thing, just something you do, basically.
Yeah, and I think I don't know if you've got any coaches on the call, but a way to kind of ease the coxes into it might be like take a video and record your coaching, and then put that video up of you coaching in a room with them, and go through it and break it down and get feedback from them, give yourself feedback. It's exactly the same thing. And I mean, I can't think of many coaches that do that. But actually, it would probably be incredibly beneficial to their coaching too. So kind of like thinking a little bit outside the box there. The willingness to kind of have a bit of shared vulnerability is probably where our biggest opportunities lie.
Yeah, agreed. And I think, if you're a coach and you're unsure how to go about it in terms of actually analysing, we're going to go into these SMART goals in a minute, exactly the same way as a rower would. Sit down with the cox and say, right, what were you working on for this session that you recorded? What were the athletes working on? Because that's got to tie in. If you've gone out and said, I really want to nail the finishes this session, and all the cox is talking about is the catch, then, that may be a bit of a disconnect there that needs to be looked at. And you go through in the same way. You go through, you might have headings that you go through. You might be quite structured, or it might be a bit more of a specific thing that you're looking at, one specific thing. So in exactly the same way a cox would look at their recordings, you should be, you should be attacking that as a coach as well. So I think that's the next thing we want to talk about is how do you do it? And for me, the most important thing to start with before you listen to your recording is you think about your goals. And I think, we could do and we probably should do an entire webinar about goal setting. But, we talk about these SMART goals, and Morgan helpfully wrote down what the acronym stands for, because last time we did one of these sessions, we just couldn't get the words out for some reason. But the SMART goals, so any goal you make should be specific, it should be measurable, it should be achievable, it should be relevant, and it should be time bound. So there's a, a time frame in which it can happen. Now, when you are sitting down to listen to your recordings, you've got to think, right, what were my goals this session, this week, this month? What is it that I was working on? Because if you can identify those goals, you can identify whether or not you've done it, or whether or not you need to continue working on it. And I think that example I gave of kind of you using rowers' names is quite an easy one to understand, because it's easy to analyze. You can literally listen to your 8-minute race recording, or your 20-minute training recording, or whatever, and you can even you can literally make a note of how many times you use their name, so you can listen a week later and do exactly the same thing. So that's quite an easy one, to do. But again, Morgan, you might have sort of similar or slightly different suggestions of things, just to kind of get people's minds working on what kind of goals they might have.
Yeah, I think it can be anything from I'm sure there are words that you say as to just fill the gap, to just fill some time. So that might be like yeah, or like yeah boys, or good. And it's minimizing the time you say those. That might be something. Or it might be this was always something for me, is like I would like hit full throttle, and if I hit it, I'd hit it hard, and I would get feedback. And it's like trying to being like, okay, I'm going to try and minimize the audio feedback I get. So that's like when the recording is like, you're like,
Wiki.
yeah. And it's like, and so those are kind of other ways of doing that. I sometimes think in the heat of the moment, the rower doesn't necessarily notice it, but I think those can kind of be different areas. Or it might be you have a bit of an idea that, so everyone has a talking voice. The way that Zoe and I are talking to each other now, like that is your talking voice. And when you cox, you can use that same voice. You might have to project a little bit more, but your talking voice might be one of your most powerful ones.
Mm.
And so you could think about, okay, I'm going to try and use that voice a little bit more in this session. Or you think, okay, I've got bursts coming up, so I'm going to play around with being a little bit more aggressive when I build them, but then I'm going to use my talking voice to give them feedback on how the boat's moving. And so you're practicing changing tone to kind of, for a very specific reason. One is to build them up, one is to provide informative information, data. This is how we're moving. This is our next step. So just playing around with little things like that, really.
And I think the feedback one was quite an interesting one, Morgan, that you just mentioned, because you know how you were saying about how you can literally get anyone to listen to your recordings. So I think at one point I had my grandpa listen to one of my recordings. He knows nothing about rowing, but he was a sound recorder in the film industry. So what he does know about is hearing clear, concise sound. That's what he knows. He knows how to um, you know get that sort of good quality sound. So he could sit there and say, I don't know what you're talking about, but I can hear every word you're saying, and it's clearly enunciated. So that's an example of when you can really get anyone to listen and get feedback from anyone. So yeah, so I think you need to be thinking about these goals before you start. And another example I had was I was saying girls too much. And in fact, you might even get that in this recording potentially. And it was annoying me. And like Morgan, I think the rowers probably didn't even notice it that much, but it was really annoying me. So that was one of my big goals for a while, was to stop calling everyone girls. But if you're not sure about how to set your goals and what you should be setting, this is a really good time to try and sit down with your coach and go through the kind of thing that they're looking for, or speak to some of the, especially sort of more experienced rowers or more experienced coxes in your club even, and start to set yourself those goals. And goals, there's always a value in setting these kind of short-term and long-term goals. And really, this is probably obvious, but when we talk about goals, we're talking about process goals rather than outcome goals. So your goal shouldn't be, I want to cox the first 8 and I want to win Henley. Like, that might be what you want, but you should be looking at process goals. So it should be, like we were saying, thinking about your tone, the variation that you use, your technical knowledge, your steering, all these kinds of things. Like, how are you going to get into the first eight? Not just, I want to be in the first eight. So that's the sort of thing that you should be going away and thinking about. And you might have 20 goals, but pick one to work on this week. For your 4 outings at the weekend and your 1 outing during the week or whatever. This is the goal I'm working on, this one single one. It might be that you have one goal that you work on for a month. That's fine. There's really no problem with that at all. If you're going in and you're saying, oh, I want to say girls less, and I want to be clearer, and I want to use their names, and I want to make sure that I'm giving them, split times every 500 meters in the pieces. Oh, and making sure that I'm also telling them the right, you're never going to be able to change all these things at the same time. And it's going to be difficult to measure whether you're making improvements. So try and pick one thing at a time to work on, and start from there.
Yeah.
Right. Anything else on there? Do you want to finish up on that and I'll get my recording ready?
Yeah, I think another good thing to kind of bear in mind is when someone else listens to a recording, unless they were in the boat with you, they can't necessarily say whether what you said truly made a difference or not. And I think when you listen to your recordings, sometimes it's really useful to listen to them with a rower from the boat. But if you're listening to them yourself and you're going through, like, have a think about, like, do I genuinely feel like this made a difference, or it didn't? And I think your gut inclination is usually pretty bang on. And I think that can be quite an effective way to really assess what you're doing. You'll have races. I'm sure, Zoe, this is the same for you. There are races where you genuinely feel like the crew is in the palm of your hand. Like, every word you say, they are hanging on to. And so that is like the optimum. That's one of the best feelings in the world. And you have to really build up to that point. And so a lot of your recordings that are building up like sequentially until you get to that kind of finishing race or something, you don't quite feel like that. It's a little bit of improvement in each area. You might have like 25% of the race where you thought, yeah, I was really in control there. And the other bit, you're like, oh, I'm not quite sure. I was really trying to figure it out. But growth is growth, and being able to kind of see that is all part of the process.
Progress, not perfection. The other thing that we probably should have opened with, to be honest, is especially when you're listening to other people's recordings, learn from them. You pick things up, you'll hear things you like the sound of, calls or tones or things like that. But make sure that if you're going to use any of that back, A, it makes sense in your voice, and B, it makes sense in the context of the row you're having, your outing or your race or whatever. I've heard a lot of recordings that are sent to me that sound like parrots of recordings that I know are out there on the internet by really good coxes who are really good, know exactly what they're saying, but then someone's parroting it back in a way that doesn't make sense for them. And the example I give, which if you've done any more than one of these WOX webinars, you've probably heard me tell this story already, and Morgan definitely has, is that when we were doing when I was at Oxford and we were looking at race plans, we were setting up our own race plan. We looked at some of the previous year's race plans just to kind of get an idea about the structure, and and the year before me, they'd had a couple of years before me, they'd had an American guy coxing them, and their big move, their big like race move was badass motherfuckers. And I was like, well, I can't say that because I'd sound really stupid if I said that, and you'd all just start laughing in the middle of the race. But I can find a way. What he wanted to give them, a confidence, a sort of a cockiness. That was what that call was about. I can find ways to say that, but it'll use different words to make it make sense in my voice. So it's kind of finding, what works for you. Right. I'm going to play you about a minute or 90 seconds of my recording. This was actually part of the warm-up for the Women's Head, which I raced a couple years ago with a sort of reunion crew. It was like most of my crew from the Rio Olympics and then some subs. I mean, Helen Glover was one of the subs, so I shouldn't, subs, important subs, good subs.
Pretty good sub, really.
Pretty good sub. And we'd had like 1 or 2 outings together the day before, but some of these guys hadn't rowed in quite some time, or had only rowed a few sessions in, even a couple of years. So for me, what I was really focused on in the warm-up was just bringing everyone together, making sure we were all on the same page. And I was also trying and failing. Well, we'll come back to this because you guys will have to tell me what you think of the recording. But I was trying to make sure that I used language that my Rio crew, who knew my coxing like the back of their hands and had listened to me cox for hours and hours and hours, would understand, but also the 2 subs would understand. Because, you fall into these patterns with your crew, the shorthand, but I needed to make sure that these 2 subs also, knew what was going on. So this was a minute at race pace in the warm-up. Hopefully you guys can all hear this. Morgan, I think if you mute as well, that's probably the best chance of everyone hearing it. If you guys can't hear this or are struggling to hear it, pop something in the chat and we'll, I don't know what we'll do, but we'll panic probably. Right, let's hope this works.
Okay, ready to build into our minutes? So let's go to 24 on this one. Ready, go. Yeah, so power and length as we build. Good. 24. Ready to build the race pace from here, just straight to race pace. Ready, go. Take the boat. Take the boat. Take the boat. Now loose. Loose there. Loose there. Loose there. Hard on the rudder. Loose there. Yeah, keep moving. Good. 33 and a half, 34. Nice rhythm. On that hang. Ready now. Hang through. Hang through. Hang through. Hang through. Yeah, good. This is what we want. Remember this. Nice. Okay, bows, pick us up. Right on it. Yeah. Good. And down. Sorry about that.
I think I start bitching about another crew there, so I'll stop that recording there. Okay, also listening to that back, that wasn't a minute, so clearly I have an inability to count, so that should probably be the first thing that goes down on the. But if anyone has any things like feedback, so what would you think about, given those goals that I was talking about, bringing people together, making sure it was clear, making sure we were all on the same page. Has anyone got things that they liked or that they think could be done better? Stick some ideas in the chat, shout them out. Morgan, you can start us off.
I always think, so, I was trying to think about setting the scene in my head. Like, I'm quite a visual person. So we're talking about 8's head, warming up. You were building to 24 and then you wanted to try out getting to race pace. So I was thinking about, okay, what's going on where you are? I thought what was quite good was you can hear the moments where, so you go hard rudder. And I think that sort of information is very useful. So you're still focusing on the job. You're very much keeping everyone on task, but the rowers know you are doing something intentionally. Whereas if they felt the rudder and you hadn't pre-warned them, then that's when you get a bit of a twitchy crew. But I thought it was very clear in the, okay, we're going to 24, get them up to 24. It's clear when you're on 24, and then you were very clear on we're going to go up to race pace. And I think sometimes you run the risk of people not knowing what the plan is. So I think it just being very transparent. We're going to 24, we're at 24, we're going to race pace. Something I was taught at Oxford was you want to say, this is the plan. This is how we're going to do the plan. We're going to do the plan, ready, go. And then that's like a 3 things. If you continually follow that process, then you're keeping your 8 minds on board on what you're trying to do.
I like that.
I also love, I love when the rowers give you feedback. I think that you, as a cox, you vibe off that energy. It was you could really hear you were using your voice to bring about that turn of speed when you're coming up to race pace. You're like, this is what we want. Remember this. That's so critical because you have to get the right speed, otherwise you're going to undercook it. And then the fact that you're saying this is good, you know, this is what we want, and then you hear the rower be like, yeah, then they evidently agree. And a rower isn't going to do that if they don't agree. I think that's always a really, really good sign.
Yeah, I agree with those things. I think, you know, when I listened back, I thought, yeah, that was clear. I think if I was one of those subs and wasn't used to my coxing, I still would have understood what we wanted to do. I think one thing, if I'd gone back again, I think I did at some point say, oh, we're at rate 33, 34, and this is what, this is good. We want to stay here. I think retrospectively, I probably would have liked to do that a little bit sooner, because I think it's important that, especially in a new crew, when you're not used to, you know, you're not quite sure what you're aiming for. It would have just been good to kind of set the scene on that a little bit. And Kate's coming through now and saying just space between the calls, which I think is a really important one. And I'd say one of the things that I pick up on most when I listen to people's recordings is that it's kind of continuous sound, like you've described, Kate, but also one change coming after another. So people are calling for quick catches and then big finishes and then on the legs, and it's all coming one stroke after another, and you don't actually give the rowers a chance to react. And I think actually in that minute I probably only called one or two ideas, I suppose, which is all you want really in a minute.
And I think that's probably one of the hardest things to do. You can repeat yourself. Repeating something isn't necessarily saying more, because you're saying the same thing. And I think that can sometimes be a bit of a challenge, is you want to, people like talk less but say more, and don't change subject. Whereas I think the key part is like don't be flip-flopping between target areas, but that's hard, that is hard to do. But I always think if you get that urge where you want to add something else in, like remember it and be like, okay, so in 20 strokes time, if I think we've still nailed our catches, then I'm going to talk about them.
I can come back to this.
That's a good one for later.
Yeah. And something that Rachel's just put in is about efficiency of your words. And someone asked a question about this as well, about how to stop using filler words. And that's a really good, smart goal that you can easily analyze. Am I just keep saying, yeah, making sounds just for the sake of making sounds kind of thing. And that was one of the things I used to think a lot about with my coxing, was every noise that was coming out of my mouth had to be adding. And sometimes those filler words, those yap, on it, whatever, they are adding, because you're saying, yes, this what you're doing is good, keep doing it. So sometimes those words are really important, but it's finding the balance of, are you using them so often that they're losing meaning? So I think that's a really important one, and is kind of easy. That's an easy one to kind of pick up on in analysing recordings. It's hard to change, but it's easy to pick up on. And I think a good way to kind of check on that, if you listen to your recordings and you think, oh yeah, I do that a lot, is to start in training. So in training, challenge yourself. Can I be quiet for a whole minute? Can I be quiet for 2 whole minutes? How long can I leave it without feeling that awkward, like, oh God, I better say something just to fill the silence? Because if you can challenge that in training, that's something that you're then probably going to be able to bring into your pieces and then bring into racing. Obviously, in a 2K race, you're not going to be silent for a minute, but 3 or 4 strokes of silence is really powerful, because then when you come back in after, people are going to really listen and it's going to be really clear.
And I think it's understanding why you would use those periods of silence. So yes, it is going to emphasize the call you're about to make, but also it allows you an opportunity to think about what's going on. And racing is so fast paced. Any second that you get to honestly just take a step back, think, this is where we are. Okay, I've clocked that wind shadow. We probably need to be going a little bit quicker. Right. Okay, this is the plan. You know, those are so valuable. And I also think doing it in training it's a bit like training a dog or training any animal. You want to know how they're going to respond. And when you first do it, they'll be like, why are you sitting quietly? Like, why aren't you saying more? You know, like, keep us going. We're dropping off the speed because you're not talking. And it's the kind of response to that is, well, I'm giving you an opportunity to consistently do the same thing. And racing and speed is often about being consistent and just doing that one thing. You know, this is it. Keep doing this. That sentence might be one of the best calls you ever make. And you want to feel like the best boats, every stroke they take, it feels like they create the drive. They create that stroke in the same way. And so when you give someone a job to do, I always think about coxing is like, you give the rower a job and they should deliver upon that job until you give them another job. And so being able to train the crew to be able to do that is really important. And that starts in training. And then you practice it in a race. And then the further through the season you get, if you're staying with the same crew, then you could probably make a race call, or you can say, we're going to build to 24, ready, go. And then you don't have to say anything else other than, yep, on rate, because they know how they're going to build. They know how many strokes is going to be over. And they know how they want to create that speed, but it takes time to get to that, to really get to that place.
So it's just a question about one of the calls, which was about take the boat. It was probably, Sophie, that's what you heard, because that was a call that I used a lot, was to take the boat with you. And what I mean by that is about literally picking the boat up and taking it with you. So making sure that your blade goes into the water nice and efficiently, and you're getting locked on right out there in the first 2 inches. And, you know, you're not just letting the blade sort of wishy-washy go through the water, but you're actually physically picking the boat up and levering it past the end of that spoon. So you're moving the boat with you in the body weight. And again, that's a call that I knew that certainly my Rio 8 were very comfortable with, because we talked about it all the time. But actually I knew that the subs would also be comfortable with that call, because it was a technical point that we used in the team a lot. But if I was in a boat, you know, if I was in a sort of a boat that I hadn't coxed before, you know, I'd want to explain that kind of call a bit more before I use something like that. Right, I want to get on to Morgan's recording. So I'm going to just go through a summary of what I think from that recording, thinking about my SMART goals. So I think, you know, if I was thinking about, you know, wanting to make sure I was clear, make sure that the calls, both in terms of the sort of people could actually hear the words I was saying, but also that what I was asking for was clear and concise. I think I did that quite well. I think that, you know, that was important and relevant to the race we were about to do. We needed to all be on the same page. I think the things that I would have liked to have done better was just to make sure I gave them a little bit more information a bit earlier on. And I think, you know, if I listened to the overall tone, I was getting a little bit up in my head. I would have just liked to probably just bring it a little bit down more into my talking voice, my chest voice, rather than being up here. It got a little high for my liking, but I'm probably being a bit picky. So I think that would probably be my summary. And I'd say on the whole, I thought it was like a solid bit of recording, and it made sense in the outing. So I'm going to hand over to Morgan for her recording, and we'll go from there.
Okay, so mine is also essentially the start sequence, or how we build to pace from Women's Head. I think it's from 2022, I want to say. And it is it's with the Leander crew. We're going off bow number 1. This might shock some of you guys, but when you go off bow number 1, you are, and you're thinking, you know, they're basically the national team. They are actually under a lot of pressure, because it's incredibly embarrassing if you don't win. And so the pressure that they kind of put on themselves is really quite high, and they get awfully worked up about the whole thing. And part of coxing is kind of like keeping them relaxed, you know, keeping them rowing well. And I think we'd landed maybe the day before from a big kind of winter training camp. And we just hopped into the 8 that day, rigged it up, and kind of got in and got going. And we'd been in small boats on the camp, so they hadn't been coxed. It was a bit like getting in with a load of horses and seeing how they pulled the cart. and I think it's can sometimes be a bit of a tricky one. But I want to kind of show the start area, because I think if you don't go out at the right pace at Women's Head, if you undercook it, you've undercooked the whole race. So it's a bit of a show of how I strategize getting them up there to the right intensity on kind of tired legs, to try and get after it, really. Right, hopefully this works.
Front pace. Building. Go. Building. 1 headwind. Building. 2. Legs. Now. Legs. Loose. Legs. Loose. Legs. Loose. Legs. Loose. Legs. Loose. Legs. Loose. On the rise. This one now. There. 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 38, little bit of breeze, tall, 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 leg square, this one now, in and on, in and on, in and on, 30 seconds from the start line, good start, manage the blades, we're on 37, first shift, 4 strokes, leg speed, go, knees down. Knees down, knees down, knees down, knees down. 36, 35 and a half. Good start, Leander. Good start. We're going to stay loose. We're going to pump it out at 35 and a half, okay? That's where we are now. Up and in, go. Up and in. Up and in. Up and in.
Not too sure how long that was, but hopefully that's a good snapshot for you.
So this was actually the same race?
Yeah, I think it was the same year.
It was the same year. So, but I was starting 80th. So I didn't have the luxury of starting first.
And I also think what's interesting is you might have had, you know, yours was like a reunion row, but those for those of us who were then on the team or on the team then, it was like they were our heroes. So it was like, oh my God, like they're going to beat us from 80th, you know, and that's the sort of stuff that goes through your head.
Well, we came 8th, which we were pretty pleased about.
Yeah.
So, can I go first?
Please do.
So I liked the fact that everything sounded really under control. And I think it's easy sometimes in the start for it to sound a bit frantic. And one of the things that I always listen to in a start sequence is what is actually being added. And I think, especially when you do a standing start, one of the common things you often hear is like people going half, half, quarter, quarter. It's like, if you're saying that on the stroke, they're meant to be taking that half slide or quarter slide stroke. It's too late. They've already done it by the time the word's out your mouth. So, you know, you've got to think about adding rhythm to it and adding, okay, there are going to be calls like, you know, if you've got to like lengthen now kind of call, yes, of course, you want to make sure that happens because you want people to all do it on the same stroke. But those first 5, 10, 15 strokes, it's going to be muscle memory. Like what you say is not going to really direct people in that time. And what I liked about the recording you did was that's what it sounded. It sounded like you were using your voice to add rhythm. You know, it was almost like you could have been using any words and I still, as a rower, would have known what you wanted me to do and, you know, how you wanted me to do it. Sorry if anyone can hear the baby crying in the background, by the way. I don't know if you can, but he's
No.
okay, fine, good. I'm not just ignoring my child, you know, his other parent is there. But yeah, so that I really liked that. It just sounded like, yeah, it just sounded really good in terms of the sort of rhythm of it and the tone. It didn't sound panicked. You know, you were closer to your speaking voice, I'd say, than, you know, than like a full on. It definitely wasn't that full throttle that you were talking about earlier.
Yeah, and I think for me that was something very conscious. Like I love to get after it, but in a 6.8k race, you know, on tired legs, if I go like that out the gates, that's the kind of thing that you need to help them stay at that speed when we get into kind of no man's land. You know, when you're coming around, you've gone past the blue doors and you're trying to figure out where Hammersmith Bridge is, sort of thing. And I think just with it being we hadn't been in the 8, and so just hopping in and getting on, trying to bring them together, because we were rowing a random order, so the kind of like the rhythm and trying to guide them through that, as long as we started in the right place, we were going to make it down the track. And I think it's that part of understanding your crew, understanding the group you're working with is really important. You know, just like for you with yours, with you're bringing in the kind of some people, some of the Olympians that you coxed in Rio, a couple of people who hadn't been there. Like, how do we almost amalgamate something that gives you the biggest bang for your buck as you're kind of going down that track?
Yeah, agreed. Any thoughts from the room? Please add them as you go along. What was your, Morgan, what if you kind of, you know, we really like that tone and that kind of stuff, what was the thing that you'd kind of do differently next time, I guess?
When I was listening to it, I was thinking it's quite interesting. We've gone quite far, and I didn't tell them how fast they were going. And I wondered, I'm trying to think, you know, was that intentional? Or and I think in my head it was probably because we weren't going as fast as we wanted to go. And sometimes it's tactically providing that information. Now, you could go about it a different way. You could say, okay, like, you know, we're on it's the tideway, so I could have been like, we're on a 1:30 and we're kind of aiming for a 1:29 here. Let's see if by being a bit sharper we get that. And then when they do it and it works, you're like, hell yeah, there you go. This is what we're looking for. So there is scope to kind of evolve and develop it in that way. And I think it's just knowing why you've done something. You know, if you can rationalize a reason behind something, then it's probably a conscious decision. If you've got no clue listening back, then that's probably something to work on. Yeah, that's kind of one of the first things that stuck out for me, really.
I agree, Kate, as well. You've put about a nice change in tone between the start and the settling into rhythm. Yeah, there was a sort of, it wasn't necessarily a drop in intensity. It was kind of maybe slightly volume, a drop. And you went from using slightly sharper sounds to a slightly more relaxed, talkative tone, I guess, to kind of announce that change from your sort of, okay, we need to be sharp and on this sequence, to right now we're going to get into something that we can really just hammer for the whole race.
So I think that's something that, I mean, Andrew Randall, he's the head coach of the British women at the moment. He's an Australian guy. When he's coaching, that's something he does incredibly well. So if he wants you to be more aggressive, he'll say a word in an aggressive way. If he wants you to be sharper, he makes that noise. So he'd be like, sharpen up around the front, and he might say down the movement, he'd be like, chip, or he'd be like, chip, finish. And he guides you. It's like the staccato kind of way of being the conductor of the orchestra. And it's also, I went on a bit of a work recruitment trip around Switzerland in November, and I was in one of the kind of German speaking areas, and I was sat in the launch listening to the coaching, and it was in all German, and I don't speak German. You know, I can just about speak English for people to understand, but I could understand what they were saying, and I could understand what kind of change they were trying to bring about, and what part of the stroke they were talking about. And it's that rhythmical talking and using words and saying the word in relation to what the word means. That skill set, if you can do that, that's really impressive.
Yeah. And I think this is a good one as well. I was thinking about what I was saying earlier about making sure that you've heard something cool in a recording. Does it work for you? So that change that Morgan did when she kind of settled onto her rhythm was a bit of I don't want to say it didn't lag, but it was a slight relaxation, which is what you maybe need in a head race, in that kind of head race. That wouldn't have worked for me, say, in my 2K race plan for the Olympics, where my race plan was like, at 100 meters, it was like more legs. At 200 meters, it was like, now hit this 200 meters, 300 meters, it's like, hit it again. You know, there was no time for relaxation. So you've got to think, I really like that. How can I use that in a way that it makes sense for my crew?
Yeah, I massively agree. I think, and thinking about like the physiology of the race itself, when you're doing a 2K race, when you go to transition to rhythm, it is the part of the race, it's one of the main parts of the race that the rowers dread. It is agonizing. the revs are up at 5,000 revs. The revometer's going off like this. And not only do you want them to row harder, you want them to row longer, and you want them to move the boat further. And it's just an awful sensation. But when they commit to it, you know, they're taking the 4 hardest strokes of their lives at that point in time, it really works. And they have to kind of go through this period where they're in pain, but because of they are strategically changing how they're moving, their body can change its energy systems. And that's exactly what's going on. And you've got to be a little bit more forceful when you're asking for that, because if they can't hear the intent in your voice and how serious this part of the race is, they aren't going to do it in the same way. And I think that's quite important.
Completely agree. I think that's a really good point. We've literally got a minute or 2 left, so I was just trying to have a quick look down through some of the questions that were asked earlier. There was one that just stuck out to me. Someone asked, is it okay to ask other coxes to listen to their recordings? And I'd say, yes, 1,000,000 times yes, but you have to be prepared to share yours as well. And that's where we were talking about earlier about having the team atmosphere where everyone does stuff together. And there was one also that stood out, which was like, what makes a good Cox recording? And there's just no answer to that. I've been thinking about it all day. In fact, a few people asked that. There's not a word, there's not a phrase. It's about, I mean, I'd say I can pick out a few things that would make a bad coxing recording. The main one being if I can't understand what you're saying. Like that's a game over situation. You know, if you're so garbled or you're shouting so much that I can't actually pick out the words, like that's automatically not a good recording. It's something for you to work on for next time. It's a relatively easy fix. But there's nothing, what the important part of these recordings is that they make sense in the context in which they were recorded. And sometimes the cool won't sound interesting or cool, but it'll be exactly what they needed. And I think, Morgan, you said earlier something about, oh, just keep doing this or something. And I was thinking, I said that in my Olympic final. I said, keep doing what you're doing. And it was exactly the right call for that point in time. Doesn't sound particularly interesting, but, if I'd been asking for more at that point, it all would have, potentially would have gone wrong. So it's really difficult to pick out specific things. And this is why it's important for you to get used to listening to your own recording. So you're building up a bank and you're thinking not just about that recording in isolation, but about your progress, your process, where you're coming from, where you're going to.
And I think if you feel like you don't quite know where to start, this is quite a unpleasant way to start it. But if you did a 2K yourself, get on, give yourself a reasonable split target. No one's going to break the world record. But get on by yourself in a room with no one around and row a 2K hard, and you'll talk to yourself. And what you say to yourself and that framework and how you do it is probably a good place to start, because you're not going to be like, do something on this catch and pull harder now and then do this and then do that and we're going to jump 5 splits and go to here, because it's not possible. Whereas you're probably going to be like, okay, you're all right, you're 750 in, just keep doing this, just keep pressing it until you get to 1,000. Yeah, breathe, this is good, you're okay. And then it allows you to have a bit of an insight into what you're trying to do. You're trying to manage someone's physiology and psychology down a track.
I love that. That's great. And if you don't want to row it, do an 8-minute hard run or yeah. Okay, I think we should probably leave it there. I feel like we could have done this all day. So maybe, if this is a session that you guys enjoyed, it might be something that we can do again, or perhaps we try and maybe do this in smaller groups where people bring a little bit of their own recording. If you're out there and you think, you want to do some more in-depth work on your own, or with your group, with your club, with your school, whatever, feel free to get in touch with us, because we do, we do some, as WOX, we do some sort of private work as well. But thank you for coming. I think that was really good. I think if you're going to take away anything from this session, it's just get out there and give it a go, and set yourself those smart goals and work from there. Morgan, last thoughts?
Yeah, I think you can't be afraid of making mistakes, because we have all made many mistakes, and we will continue to make mistakes. And a failure isn't doing something wrong. It's not picking yourself back up from that point. And sometimes just doing something that wasn't quite the right way is the quickest way to learn the best way to do it. So I think as well, it's like being a student of the sport with an open mind and allowing that to energize you is much more of a sustainable way to approach, well, most things really.
Agreed. So thanks, guys. Appreciate you coming. If you've got feedback for us from the session, feel free to slide into our DMs, as the kids say, or used to say, and let us know what kind of sessions that you want to see in the future. But yeah, thanks for coming. And now we'll see if I've managed to successfully record this or not. So thanks, guys.
Much, everybody.